In this lesson, we're going to be looking at functions, and functions are a crucial part of learning and understanding JavaScript. And what functions do is they allow you to execute a block of code or predefined block of code. So essentially allows you to, much like variables where we hold some information, functions work similar to that, which gives us a value that we can input, and then we could render out some predefined set of coding. So it's kind of like a variable, but for coding. So we're going to look at why we need functions, different types of functions, how functions work, differences between scope, global scope, and local scope, passing arguments, and returning values. So let's open up our editor and start creating some functions. So let's create a function. So basic function is defined by the word function. And this is one of those reserved words within JavaScript that you can't use as a variable name. So function, and then we need to give the function a name. So much like what we were doing with variables, we need to give it some way to identify it within the rest of our code. So in this case, I'm just calling it my fun. And we do the rounded brackets, and then we do curly brackets, and then within the curly brackets, this is where we run and add that executable code. So within here, we've been working with console log, and I'm just going to show you what happens when we run the function. So let's open up, let's get out of the function. So the function itself, this is the self-contained code within the function, and now I can initiate this code at any point within the rest of my JavaScript simply by calling over to my fun. And I can actually do it multiple times and have that code executed out multiple times. So let's take a look at our editor, and we see that console log is executing out hello, 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 and we see the line of code is the second line of code. So it's rendering all of those out within the function. So that's really nice and useful, but functions can extend quite a bit further, and they can do quite a bit more. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to set a value for the function. So this is probably the simplest example of a function, but let's take this one step further, and we're going to bring it down here, and I'm going to create another function, but this function is actually going to pass over some information. So if I've got a variable of x, I've got a value of 5 on it. Now I'm going to create a function. So I'm going to call this one my fun2, and then within those rounded brackets I'm going to pass over a parameter or a value. So in this case, maybe I can pass over a value of hello, or maybe we'll just do it numeric. So either or, it could be an integer, it could be a string. So let's pass over a value of 7 and see what happens now. So within the function, we now need to create a function. So my function, and just got to name it the same as what I'm calling it. So my fun2, and in this case, what I want to do is I want to pick up this value that's being passed as the argument. So I need to define a variable that's going to hold that value while it's being used within the function. So let's take variable container of a. So when we initiate the myfun2 with the value argument of 7, we're going to pick that up, and a is now going to hold the value of 7. And you're going to be able to see that within the console log. We're going to output the value of a. And I'm actually going to do a few more of these functions just so that you can get a better idea of exactly what's happening. And maybe even this one can be a string, so to do something even different. So let's take a look at this now, and we're going to see what happens and what gets output. So we see that we get 7, 17, hello world, and what's happening here is that myfun2 is passing over this value, and a now holds in that value that was passed through, and now we can do something with it. We can execute it out, and we can make something happen. So let's take a look at this a little bit more and create a value for, so let's create a variable in here, and we're going to give it a variable, so variable b, and we're going to take the value of a, and we're going to add 100 or 100 to it, and we're going to console log out the value of b. So now let's take a look at this. So what do you think is going to happen here? We see that we've got taken the functions one step further where we're passing in all of this dynamic content. It's depending on which line of code, and all we have to do is create that variable value in there, and within the function itself we're picking up that argument, we're adding 100 to it, and we're outputting within that console. So we know that what happens is that it runs through that function, it treats it as a variable, and it outputs the content that's being placed in there. And the really interesting thing about it is that we can have a number of different variables. So I can pass over a number of values, and I can pick up all of those values within my function. So now I've got a number of values. I can simply add those together, and we can take another look at this, and now we see that we've got all of those values are added together. It really truly does become fairly powerful and gives us the ability to create some dynamic return values and dynamic capability. And also now we can also take this another step further, and I could go variable d is equal to maybe the myfun2, and now variable d, console log that variable d out, and we're going to show you that now we're going to hold this value of what's being passed in here. So maybe what I can do is I'll add into strings, and we'll see that what happens with the strings. So what happens here is that we get a value of hello world, but we notice that number 7 is logging out, it's logging out a value of undefined. So this means that we're actually doing the calculation, but we're not returning back any value. And this is something else that we can do within functions, is that we have the ability to return, to do some calculations, to do some, run through some code, and we also have the ability to return those values back out. So I'm going to show you how that works. So now we're actually going to return the value, so watch the undefined there, and now it holds the value of hello world. So we're able to run a set of code here, pass in some values, do something with those values, and return those values back, assign it to a variable, and then of course we can utilize this variable within our JavaScript. So we see the beginnings of quite a lot that we can do with functions, and we see that there's a lot of power to functions, and there's quite a lot that we can do with them. So in the next lesson we're going to look deeper into functions, and I'm going to show you some more really neat things that come along with functions, and something that you can look at when you're creating your logic for your applications. So that's coming up in the next lesson.